Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Midshipman First Class Noel Poovey. I'm an ocean engineering major here, and I have the pleasure of introducing Ms. Erin Sikorsky, the Director for the Center of Climate and Security and the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Ms. Sikorsky earned a Master of International Affairs at Columbia University and a Bachelor of Arts in Government from Smith College. She's held numerous leadership roles in the fields of strategic forecasting, geopolitical risk, and the impacts of climate change on national security. These include Deputy Director of the Strategic Futures Group on the U.S. National Intelligence Council, founding chair of Congress's Climate Security Advisory Council, and a senior intelligence analyst for conflict and instability in Africa and the Middle East. As part of the Strategic Futures Group, Ms. Sikorsky was co-author for the Global Trends Report, written every 4 years to assess the trends and uncertainties in U.S. national security strategy for the next 2 decades. In addition, she continues to share her work through television interviews on CNN, the BBC, and the Weather Channel, as well as through podcasts and articles for various organizations. She is currently an adjunct professor at George Mason University for a course she designed on climate change and national security. She's also an editor and advisor for Lawfare, the Climate Migration Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Smith College Center for Environment, Ecological Design, and Sustainability. The following panel will discuss infrastructure resilience in the face of rising seas and worsening natural disasters, specifically how the military can cope with these challenges as they affect geopolitical tensions, national security, and infrastructure costs. Ms. Sikorsky, over to you.
Thanks so much, Noel, and thanks to all of you for joining us for the final panel of the day. I promise we will keep this exciting and interesting to keep you awake as you've been here all day so far talking about these really important issues. We've got an excellent group today to talk about infrastructure resilience, as Noel said, in the face of rising seas and worsening natural disasters. And I frankly can't think of a better time to have this conversation when, as we were walking over here, we were just talking about the past few weeks and the disasters that have hit the United States in terms of Helene and Milton, both in Florida, but then up in North Carolina. But you can look really any of the past 5 years, whether it's Guam, right, our facilities there, whether it's the Marshall Islands and the rogue wave we've seen. You go back a little further to Tyndall, right? These types of disasters, rising sea levels combined with strengthened and intensified hurricanes and storms are something that our military leaders all have to contend with, and we've got a great group to talk about that today. To my immediate left, we have Admiral Daryl Caudle, who is the commander of the U.S. Fleet Forces Command. We also have Mr. John Englander, who is an oceanographer and leads the Rising Seas Institute. We also have Vice Admiral Nathan Moore, who's the commander of the Atlantic area for the U.S. Coast Guard. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from each of them and their experiences and their lessons for all of us as we think about managing into the future, right? Because these hazards are an intense problem today, but are only expected to get worse over the next 5, 10, 15 years, irrespective of what we do in terms of our energy trajectory, given the carbon that's already in the atmosphere and the changes we're already seeing. So we're going to start with Admiral Caudle to my left. And sir, I'd like to ask, in the face of a changing climate, can you provide examples of what investments or process improvements the Navy is taking to ensure mission assurance, continuity of operations, and sustained force generation?
I'll give it a good shot. I was thinking when I was in that previous panel with Tom Moore and the team, I think I'm on the wrong one. I'm here talking about climate and rising seas and that kind of thing, and I may be a little bit out of my place here, but I can certainly talk a lot about the impact that these things are having on our Navy. But before I get into that, I do want to say that for the first time, I think, at least in my career, I've seen an emphasis on this subject by Navy leadership. To the extent that Admiral Franchetti, when she put out her recent NAV plan, most of you know it's based on war fighting, of course, war fighters, of course, but the third part is the foundation. And in that, if you read in what she's put out, that's centered around exactly what we're talking about, is the recognition that the infrastructure of our Navy is not in a good place. It's not in a good place just due to historical methodologies by which we program, budget, fund, and execute that to keep these facilities running. And it's hard, as most of these panels talk about, it gets to a point where you just can't devote one major reset to getting that done. So the art and science of getting after building our infrastructure back to be the world-class Navy that we need to be is front and center in her plan. One of her Project 33 targets, if you will, is also based on the infrastructure. And when we think of infrastructure, it's a couple things there. It's one, of course, it's the facilities, the shore, if you will, the buildings, the foundry, the things that we need to actually keep our ships operating, our planes operating, and project power and control the seas. But it's also the people. And I get a lot of reports from my Naval Shore Force commanders, as we call them now, not just region commanders, where our facilities, where our students are around the United States. We've got a bucket under the roof collecting water. We may have mold and mildew concerns. And when those are brought to the attention of Navy leadership, we really get after it. So I want the folks online and in the room to really understand the extent to which we're really taking the resiliency of our infrastructure seriously. So it is a big deal. But for the context of this panel, I kind of wanted to break it into just three parts. And the first part is the thing that I care a lot about is continuity of power. And that falls under one of my broad mission sets, and a hat that I wear under Northern Command is mission assurance. And mission assurance is, of course, a broad topic that looks at critical infrastructure predominantly and the effects of any kind of threat to that critical infrastructure. And one of the predominant threats we have is, of course, climate. And if you've been awake for the last 2 weeks and watching these couple storms come through, you see that in spades. So it is definitely a challenge. The things, we had to have continuity of power, and that's ashore, of course, at sea. And that's necessary to fuel the machine that we run to actually win our nation's wars. That fuels the continuity of government, of course, continuity of decision making, so that's extremely important. Part of that's fuel efficiency. And when I talk about fuel efficiency, it's in the context of not just better equipment that runs at a higher efficiency, which is, of course, something we're always investing in and trying to break new ground to get our ADA higher, our efficiency factor higher. We're talking about hybridization of fuels and what's the right mix to do that. We're talking about sustainability. Of course, nuclear. Thank God we still have nuclear aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines that have the ultimate, in efficiency as these life of ship cores are utilized. But technologies are extremely important when we think about fuel utilization and fuel efficiency. And then the second thing I would talk about is coastline restoration. Most Navy bases, much to the chagrin perhaps of our joint force partners, is we have all our bases in really great places. And the cost of that, being on the water, of course, is surge and erosion and estuary problems that we have, just being good environmentally minded service that we are in the Navy. So these things, we are very focused on making sure that our bases are sustainable through these types of effects. And just to put a point on one of those, we've worked very hard with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science to leverage about $10 million in partner contributions to work the actual estuaries and shoreline at Yorktown Naval Weapons Station, as just an example, and where we really are trying to get some of the oyster reefs reseeded and get some of that shoreline back to the way it was originally. And then the last thing I'll just tell you is just continuity of power supply. And in that, you can't just think of just making sure that we're resilient like at our shipyards, which you were in that panel, you saw that, our bases, of course, but we fight from our maritime operations centers now. Our maritime operations centers are like platforms. They are ships. We treat them like that. And so these headquarters where we make our orders process, our decision making, carry out our warfighting functions, power continuity of those has to be absolute, just like in a float unit. So it's extremely important that it's resilient. You heard a little bit in the previous session again about microgrids. I'll put a little bit of a point on that. We have 18 of those operational now in the Navy. We just brought one online up in New London up at the submarine base there. These are extremely important in cost sharing. It's efficient, and it makes us very resilient to the outages in certain places. So it's extremely important. And of course, near and dear to my heart is, of course, nuclear power and the small modular reactors. I'm working with Meredith Berger on that project quite a bit to make sure that we are looking into that. And then the last thing I would tell you is wind farms off Virginia and North Carolina and how that impacts operations. There's been a tremendous partnership with the private industry there to get after that energy source, to make sure it does not impact where we do local operations, our composite integrated training operations, but we also are trying to get more power. So it's a collaborative effort. And all of that's kind of wrapped up in my final point in these public-private ventures. The Navy is not world-class at energy distribution. We're great at energy usage. We know how to use it, okay? So getting the experts in to help us with recapitalizing some of our aged infrastructure, and then for in-service payback. So maybe that's access, where it can come landfall at Oceana. Maybe that's actually going into a contractual partnership with how they recapitalize and we basically pay them for services. These PPVs are really taking traction. We're doing it with water, and we're certainly doing it with electricity. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Admiral. I mean, two things I heard in your statement there. One, I really appreciate your opening comments about it's not just about infrastructure, but it's about people, right? And the resilience. When we talk about building resilience to climate disasters and hazards, we have to think about people. The other thing you reminded me of is something my colleague John Conger often says with the military. It's about missions, not emissions, right? And why we care about climate, why we're tackling these climate issues, is because it impacts the mission. And you gave a lot of good examples of how that works out. Now we're going to turn to John Englander, because to understand how climate impacts the mission, we need to have good data, right, and scientific information. And we see that the estimates for rising seas and disaster flooding this century vary greatly. And I want to ask you if you can help us understand the conflicting estimates for rising seas, and also give us some practical guidance about how we can strengthen our preparedness for mid-century and beyond.
Sure. Actually, it's great to do this as the bookend to this morning's opening when Admiral Spicer was talking about the role of history and the things that happened a century ago with World War I have shaped what's happening today in the world around us. And it's sea level's perfect context to that, but we've got to go back a little bit further than a century. We've got to look back a few thousand years and see some patterns, and then also understand what's it going to be like in the coming century or so, because that's the challenge. How do we build resiliency into the system in a world that we've never seen before as humans? Sea level's been fairly stable, as I'll show you in a couple of slides, for about 6,000 years. That's human civilization, more or less. Okay? Sea level has not changed. Sea level sets the shoreline. When sea level goes up 10 feet, 3 meters, the shoreline moves inland. And over long periods of time, the opposite can happen too. We've never seen that. So when we talk about history and learning from history, it's great. It's a really great bookend to saying, is this climate change human-caused or not, is a valid question. But regardless, frankly, when there have been climate changes before, what has that meant for populations, people, economies, nations, wars, and so on? So let me show you a couple of slides just to kind of put some perspective. Everybody knows what Florida looks like. It's an iconic shape of a state with some humor to that in some ways. 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age cold spot, when the ice sheets were bigger, sea level was 390 feet. I'm going to round it up to 400 feet. I believe in using numbers. Let's just make them approximate so we get concepts, not get buried in the detail. Sea level is 390 feet lower than today. Sea level, not waves, not tide changes or anything like that. But we'll look at the history of this. So Florida was twice the size because sea level was down 400 feet almost. And conversely, at the warm spot in the last ice age cycle, which I'll illustrate in a moment, sea level was 25 feet higher. So the shoreline was way inland and Florida was about half the size. We could do the same diagrams for the Chesapeake, for Boston Harbor, for the Bahamas, for any place of the 140 nations that border the ocean. But it's particularly recognizable with Florida, which is relatively flat. to Erin's question, the reason that estimates for sea level rise vary so widely is because of the varying rates of change in the source, which is the melting of Antarctica or Greenland. The Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets together hold enough ice that if it melts, sea level would be 212 feet higher. That's today's, by the amount of ice today. It has changed over centuries and millennia. In fact, I'll show you the pattern of the ice ages in a moment. There's no way to predict accurately when those two ice sheets are going to melt, or even 10% of them is going to melt. And partly it goes back to things which we've been hearing about today. If you don't know what you're going to use for fuel sources, if you're going to use natural gas or methane, or you're going to use nuclear power or all renewables, that's going to affect the temperature on the planet. The temperature on the planet is going to contribute to the melt rate. Makes sense? And so nobody pretends that we know the energy policy for 30 years from now or 50 years from now or end of the century. So the most fundamental level, the question is, how warm does the planet get? We know that it's about 1.2 degrees. That's about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.2 degrees Celsius, about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than before we got in the industrial era. That's well documented and not even in dispute anymore. We don't know what the temperature will be 50 years from now. And we can't possibly, because we haven't agreed on the policy. We don't know what the population will be. We don't know how much AI is going to drive our demand for more electricity, which is going to require more generating power, which is going to warm the atmosphere. We don't know those things. So let's be realistic. You see graphs for sea level rise projections. This is a very simple one. It comes out of the IPCC, and it's in the latest NOAA technical report. I have to smile when I see this. It's got 5 different colored lines for sea level, as if those are projections. They're not projections. I mean, they're just 5 curved lines, almost equally spaced. And people say, well, we don't know which curve sea level is going to follow. See, sea level doesn't follow a curve. Okay? When we look at the history, as we will in a moment, sea level has risen or fallen in fits and spurts and leveled off for a while, like changing hurricane patterns. Okay? So there's, even in the science community, we tend to do a disservice because we think of this as projections. Those are not projections. In fact, sea level will exceed them all, I think, and it will jump from bar to bar on its pathway, would be my guess. What do we know about global sea level? Just in like two bullet slides here to keep it as simple as possible. The effect of rising sea level will be global. It will not only affect every coastal city in the United States, but the other 139 coastal nations. It's going to move their boundaries in permanently. We've never seen that. We've seen erosion, as you referred to. We see storm damage. We see storm surge, right? Heavy rainfall, runoff. We've never seen sea level be 10 feet higher than it is today. Not in the human experience. Right now, the rise of sea level is slow, but it's accelerating. And to get to the bottom line, the truth is it's already unstoppable. And I will put that in the context of what's natural and what's human-induced. It's essentially permanent because it operates on the scale of centuries or millennia. And the forces that are now unleashed, no matter what we do, are not going to go back to where they were. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. You can't turn the omelet into eggs anymore, okay? We've passed a point of no return. We should try and slow it, and that's an important issue, and collectively, we as a society will decide what we can do to slow it as the problem gets worse and worse, which is happening in front of us. But it's very different from flooding. We think of flooding, and we all can cite lots of flood events, as I think we just heard. Flooding is water that comes in and then recedes, and you can go back to normal and kind of drying things out. Erosion is a little bit different as well, but we tend to think of it all similar. Sea level rise is different because it happens incrementally, like a drip filling the bucket, but overnight the bucket's overflowing and there's water on the floor. If you look at sea level rise since we began keeping records in 1850, it's been rising pretty steadily. That's a consensus simplified graph showing how sea level has changed since we began keeping worldwide meteorologic records in the year 1850. In the upper right is a satellite. The records get a little more precise as we have satellite altimetry. The TOPEX 1992 was the first satellite that could accurately measure sea level on a continuous basis. And since then, been many generations of that. Since we've kept satellite data, looking back a century, sea level has been rising at about 1/4 of an inch a year on average. It's now up to about 1/3 of an inch, and it's actually nearing 1/2 inch. This is in millimeters. Sorry, I should have put it in U.S. units. But it went from 1.5 millimeters to 3.2 to 5 millimeters. That's a doubling curve. Think back to the pandemic when we got into doubling, and it's surprised, 100 people could die. No, 1,000 people could die. No, 10,000 people could die. No, 100,000 people. No, 1 million, 2 million, is it 4 million? The numbers kept going with exponential growth. It's hard for us to interpolate or project out anything with any clarity, frankly. Once we go linear to nonlinear to curvilinear, but when we get to abrupt changes, to step changes, it's a whole different challenge to predict, and that gets to the issue of what's the future going to be like. Just to show you what sea level has been, I mentioned this earlier, but it's a great graphical illustration. There's a building on the right, a 47-floor building. Sea level since the last ice age, 20,000 years ago on the left, was rising over 390 feet to get to the present level. And you can see that for the last 6,000 years, the end part of that graph, it's pretty flat. That's human civilization. Sea level did not change much in all of human civilization. But we know from the geologic record, this is totally indisputable, that that's how sea level rose as an approximation. So we can see a couple of things here. Sea level can have long periods of stability, like 6,000 years. It can rise 400 feet in 10,000 years. And in fact, if you drill down on where those 3 arrows are, and this I guess I should point that way, those 3 inflection points, changes in slope, are when sea level rise went from a few inches a year to a foot a year, or I should say a foot a decade. We had 10 feet of sea level rise per century for 4 centuries, where those 3 arrows are. That's Earth history. It's a simple geology measurement at this point. Okay, it's not an opinion. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. Of course, there wasn't even a White House back then. Okay, but that's the history of sea level rise. We should be aware of that. We should bring this into our culture, just like we learned from naval history to learn what are the lessons, for the future and projecting strength and deterrence and all the things we've talked about all day. We have a new enemy. This one is not a political enemy or a nation, a hostile force, a space invasion. Okay, this is the ocean rising, which it's done before. This is a graph that's in my books, and it's on a website, and you're welcome to use it. A lot of scientists use this now. This is 400,000 years of sea level rise across. In blue at the bottom bar, the red bar is global average temperature, or the ice age cycles, which I'll just explain in a moment. And the green is a greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, as you all heard of, greenhouse gases. So start with the red line. From left to right, it's 400,000 years. It's 4 ice age cycles. The up and down pattern is a natural pattern. Humans had no impact on that. And it's about 100,000 years. It varies slightly. And it's a change in temperature of 5 degrees Celsius or 9 Fahrenheit. That's what we think of as the ice ages. It's been going on for 2.5 million years by nature. You can see the strict pattern to it. As the planet warms, the ice sheets melt and the sea level rises. So that's why the red and blue lines go together. You can see there's a sharper up phase and a slower down phase. That is about 20,000 years of rising and about 80,000 years of cooling and ice sheets expanding and sea level falling. But the green line is the mysterious one. Why does carbon dioxide parallel the temperature and the sea level? And it's for 2 different principles, if you will. That carbon dioxide traps heat in the atmosphere, as demonstrated in 1859. That's pretty widely accepted, and that's a factor in the warming that's happening, the changing weather patterns. But there's a natural cycle that reverses that. The reason that even before human impact, that those 2 lines were going up and down together is that as the Earth follows the orbital pattern that we think of as causing the winter-summer and the seasons and the changes over a 19-year cycle, the orbital cycle of that drives the tides in effect. Okay, the tides follow a 19-year cycle, as many of you probably know. There's daily high and low tide, lunar monthly, but it follows a 19-year pattern. That's because of the other planets exert pulls, and the elliptical orbit around the sun changes. So the Earth was having these natural ice age cycles without our involvement. What we have now is an overlay of both things, that there was a natural cycle and now there's a human-induced cycle. So if we're going to look into the future and understand what's going to happen and decide how does it affect our equipment, our readiness, our preparedness, and really the survival of not only cities and states but nations, we really need to get a little deeper and pull the politics out of it, as far as I'm concerned. To summarize, global sea level rise this century, if you ask me for what's my number, I'd say plan on 8 feet, but it could be worse. That's a big number. Most people don't plan 75 years in advance. Based upon the history, when sea level, as you saw in that prior graph, sea level was rising at the rate of more than 10 feet a century for 4 centuries. That's Earth's history. Had nothing to do with us. So, but learning from that and knowing that that can happen by nature, and now we're warming 100 times faster than in nature, we do need to start thinking differently. And that's why it's so appropriate to have this conference here. And I'm so appreciative that you invited me to be part of this as a bookend, really, to where we started this morning with history of naval history and what can we learn from that, too. Rising seas and shifting shorelines are unstoppable now. We really do need to think different. And that's regardless of greenhouse gas reduction. If we reduce greenhouse gas about 30%, but we're still going to be in this warming mode, which is going to melt more ice from Greenland and Antarctica and raise global sea levels. So it's not an either or, and a lot of people get that wrong. They think that if we just have enough electric vehicles and enough solar panels that we're going to stop climate change. We're already at a point where we've warmed the oceans to the point that the oceans are measurably warmer, as most of you know. Here's the kicker number. If you take that graph I showed you a minute ago, the 400,000 years, you take the height change in sea level compared to the temperature change, we know that over long periods of time, once the ice sheets have adjusted in their size, that the change in ocean height is about 20 meters, 65 feet, per degree Celsius. You may have picked up that the goal is to try and keep the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, right? It's unlikely we're going to be able to do that, but we should try. But even if you stopped the warming today and kept the temperature at 1.5 degrees Celsius, somewhere in the next few centuries, we have tens of feet of sea level rise in the pipeline. So it's a sobering thought. I'll kind of pass it on there. Cheery way to end the afternoon, I know. But seriously, it's an opportunity. It's like finding out a loved one has a terminal illness or something that has happened to all of us in our families. Okay, you deal with the cards you've been dealt. Deal with the cards you've been dealt, and we do the best we can with what the options are. And I believe, even though this is sobering and disturbing and all that, it's going to happen over decades and centuries. And the sooner we get clear about it and teach it and work with colleagues and depoliticize it, I think the better we'll be able to cope. And to me, that's our legacy for our kids and grandkids.
Thanks, John. It's good that we have a cocktail hour after this,
yes,
I
right.
think. to deal
I
with
know
that.
where I'm buying my new oceanfront property, about Centerline, Florida.
Yeah.
I thought you were saying Tennessee or something.
Yeah. But I spent a lot of years in the U.S. intelligence community, and when I think about the range of threats that we were supposed to warn on and the limited information we had about much of what was happening in the world, other countries' plans and intentions, comparatively with climate change, we have a lot of information about what's coming down the pike that we can prepare for, right, in a different way. And no one is preparing more for that than the Coast Guard, perhaps, or at least dealing with the impacts today out on a regular basis. So, Vice Admiral Moore, I'd like to ask you, given your service's coastal focus, how has the resilience strategy evolved over time, right? From the past to today to future threats within the coastal zone. And obviously you're very focused on domestic climate issues, but how do you think about prioritizing and amplifying Arctic initiatives within the broader context of these threats?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Ms. Sikorsky. Thanks for having me. First of all, thanks for not having this panel last week, because I wouldn't have been here with Milton, or the week before with Helene. So good timing on that. Thank you for putting me after John Englander, so I have to try to follow that. I mean, I don't have any.
Somebody needs to.
I mean, I learned more in the last 20 minutes than I've probably have in a long time. So I got no cool slides for you, but what I can tell you is, yeah, the Coast Guard is laser focused on sort of the effects of climate change and how that impacts us. I'll give you an example just from last week. So for Hurricane Milton, right, or any hurricane, the Coast Guard's job, right, our job is to be on scene immediately after the hurricane lands, right, as part of the Department of Homeland Security, as part of our joint response with FEMA, right, as our mandate from our Secretary and Homeland Security. So what that means is, first of all, you got to get out of the way of the hurricane. If a Cat 3 or 4 is coming, you don't just sit there with your aircraft and our cutters, our ships, and small boats, and then hunker down and wait for it. You got to get out of the way, especially if you're talking about a Cat 3 or 4 like Milton. So we had to move everything that we had basically off the peninsula of Florida, get it out of harm's way, and then we got to be ready as the storm starts to circle in. We have helicopters last week that came up and were poised from Miami. We had helicopters in Mobile that came across that were ready, inching in as the hurricane center cone closes. We pull our resources in on the north and south. The cutters that we sorted out all the way out to Mexico, practically in the Gulf, get in behind the hurricane. Because when the sun comes up the day after the hurricane, the answer is, well, the Coast Guard will be there in a couple days. Like, no, that's not good enough, right? So we have to manage and this is not things you see or have to worry about, that's not your job, but we have to be ready to I have to make sure that our team is ready to be on scene when the sun comes up the morning after the storm lands in Tampa, right? And you see those helicopters fly in the air with those orange ones, and you see the ships out there with the stripe on them, and that's what we did for Milton, Helene, Debbie, Beryl, however, there was a couple more, Eduardo, there was a couple this year, right? So all that is harder when we have more storms, stronger storms. It's harder when we have to go farther away and inland to find places to put our assets, right? You can't, what people don't often realize is, why does the Coast Guard care about shore infrastructure? Why do we care about buildings and piers? Why do we have civil engineers? We have a lot of civil engineers in the Coast Guard. That doesn't make a lot of sense to some people. But every Coast Guard mission starts and ends at a shore facility. So we have to have civil engineers. And as was mentioned, Admiral Caldwell mentioned this, I mean, Navy the same way, right? We are by definition at or on the coastline. That's, there's not a lot of Coast Guard in Kansas, right? Like, we're just not, that's not where we're gonna be. So I think as we look forward, we have to continue, part of our strategy is to move inland and upland, replace shore facilities that are destroyed by hardened facilities. We have some fantastic examples of shore facilities in the Gulf of Mexico and even in Florida, down in Fort Myers area, that were hit by the storm that we rebuilt 5 or 10 years ago. They're built to code, they're built stilted, they're built inland and upland, and they are up and operating the day after the storm. So we go to Congress and say, hey, if you invest in us, in our shore infrastructure, we won't come back and ask you again for it after the next storm, because what we're going to build will ride out the storm, and you can actually get that done with the right civil engineering corps if you do it properly, even on the coastline today. As far as the Arctic goes, I'll just touch on that very quickly. The Coast Guard is the United States surface presence in the Arctic. There's nobody else up there, right? And that's the way we've been in the Arctic for 150 years, starting back with the whaling communities in Alaska and the Alaskan Arctic in more modern times today, also on the Atlantic side of European Arctic. The Coast Guard operates the United States polar ice breaking fleet, both Arctic and Antarctic, and there's plenty to talk about there with our upcoming polar security cutters that we're looking forward to having. So from my perspective, the Arctic, less ice equals more water, and more water is what we do. Less ice equals more traffic, more maritime activity in the Arctic. I would equate, as the operational commander on the Atlantic area side, more activity equals more risk. Something bad's going to happen in the Arctic. It's coming. Somebody's going to catch on fire, run into each other, run aground. There's a lot of big ships up there with nothing in the way of support or response assets to get there in time of need. So we are also very engaged with the Arctic Council. We're very engaged with every international engagement we rely on with the Arctic nations is how are we going to manage this increased traffic? How are we going to manage the risk to the United States and into the world community of what's going on up there? So I think I'll stop there. I certainly look forward to questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Vice Admiral. All right, all of you should be getting ready to ask your questions, and we'll take some from online as well. But before I turn to the audience, I did want to connect this panel with the earlier discussion about the defense industrial base, right, and the investments that we need to be making to modernize and move forward. And I want to talk a little bit about money, right? So what are the potential financial and operational consequences if we're not making those investments with climate-related risks in mind? And how do you think about that cost piece going forward? Maybe I'll start with you, Admiral.
Well, and it's an extremely important thing I deal with every day with our Commander Naval Installations Command and Naval Sea Systems Command dealing with this. One, these things that we're talking about, like Milton and Helene, to the extent we try to predict how many hurricanes and natural disasters we're going to have in order to try to get some monies in place to basically go correct the devastation that occurs, we always undershoot that. And so when that happens, that comes out of hide. That's something else that we were not, we were going to do and we cannot do any longer in an already very compressed budget with military construction budgets and our infrastructure operating cost and modernization. So that quid pro quo, robbing Peter to pay Paul due to these things is very devastating. It's something Admiral Gray, our Naval Installation Commander, deals with every day. As far as the real practical issues, we didn't even, we didn't talk about seismic. Seismic's an issue for these dry docks from that defense industrial base. Massive amounts of efforts up in the Pacific Northwest at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard to get those dry docks in a place where they can undergo a seismic event with a nuclear-powered warship in place to make sure that those are safe. These rising seas have an issue with our dry docks as well. Is one of the things we like in a dry dock is dry. and so when you get, in these high surge, perfect moon, perfect tide, and big storm, you can overcome Norfolk Naval Shipyard, some of the docks there. So, the way we actually go recapitalize our dry docks to make sure we get the proper quay wall heights and the barriers there is extremely important for this issue, because let's face it, when a ship is in dock, there's hull cuts there, and the water's just going to come right into the ship. So that is just a not allowed situation. So that's just a couple of things I would tell you that we're thinking about.
Vice Admiral, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, in terms of our interaction with industry, and there's two pieces of it. I mentioned the shore infrastructure and how our part of our strategy is to build resilient facilities that don't have to be rebuilt in the face of the next storm or any other sort of climate-related disaster. I think the defense industrial base is a particularly difficult one for the Coast Guard. We are small. We are very small, and so when we go to compete in shipbuilding, when we go to compete in ship repair, it's very difficult for us to compete. I mean, ship repair in particular is a difficult industry everywhere. We have one organic yard, which is actually right down the road here in Curtis Bay and outside Baltimore. But that's one shipyard and certainly does not service the entire Coast Guard fleet everywhere, and of course not on the Pacific side. So, I think the defense industrial base is something that we are very concerned about as we move forward, because if we can't sustain the assets that we have, then we just don't have a chance. The Coast, to give you everyone here perspective, the Coast Guard is, depending on how you count us, active reserve, auxiliary, civilian force, we are somewhere around 50,000 people, so that's roughly the size of the New York City Police Department for the whole world. So it's we're just a very small fish in the pond.
John, can I ask you, the information you presented and the exhortation to look to history to learn from that, how would you provide concrete advice to, say, a military planner or strategist who wants to integrate that information but is busy, already has a long list of things in their task and their duties? I mean, how can they operationalize, I guess, what you're warning about?
to recognize that the amount of sea level rise specifically is an unknowable number, just like so many other things about the future that we'd love to know but just are not knowable.
Right.
But that based upon the past, we can effectively say that over this century, we should be thinking about, perhaps up to 10 feet, which is like 3 meters. And think about it in proportions and say, if I'm dealing with something that's got to be redesigned for next hurricane season, I don't have to plan for 100 years. On the other hand, when I'm planning new infrastructure, whether it be a port, an airport, a city water system, or water supply that's down at low elevation. So think in terms of short, medium, and long term. We do it all the time, whether it be our careers or our kids' education or retirement. And that's an effective way to think about this, given the uncertainty. So think about, you don't have to do it all at once and all with the same measure of safety, if you will, or defensibility. But if we start to educate ourselves and say, did you know that sea level went up and down 400 feet by nature in what we call the ice ages? Everybody's heard of the ice ages. Remember the kids' movies? Ice Age Part 2, The Meltdown. Many of you have seen that. And that showed it. I mean, it's really an indisputable thing, but it's not on our time scale. Right. And when you put it in that, I said, oh yeah, that's true. I did believe in the ice ages. Those weren't caused by humans, but this is different. So if you put it in that context, you can say to somebody, your infrastructure or yours, you may want it to be an investment for 100 years. You don't have to do it all at once, but you may design it to be added to in phases. But you need to know that from an engineering standpoint up front, that the foundation may need to allow for a 10-foot seawall, but maybe only build 3 feet this year.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got some good questions on the screen here, and I'd like to invite folks to come up to the microphones to ask questions as well. But I'm going to start with one from the online audience, which is a question around, he's asking, with an increase in frequency of severe weather events resulting in more sorties and more impact to shipyard refits, how is this impacting the long-term health of ships and aircraft?
It's just another rock in the rucksack of things that are delaying us. It's already a very challenged situation that we're in, and the Defense Industrial Panel got after that a bit. I was thinking as that panel was going on, all this effort and money were flowing in to try to improve the industrial base. It's just not something that, and someone mentioned it like a light switch. And so these types of things took a while to get here, and they're going to take time to get out. And we're not great when we have to integrate long-term effects. And so as a humanity, in my opinion, so it's challenging to get the rudder over on some of these problems that we're experiencing with maintenance and new construction. In fact, most of those things, since we've invested that, you could probably go check the numbers on this, quite frankly, have gotten a little worse, in fact. And some of that's because, there's just taking time to get these improvements in place. So every time a big storm comes, just to put a point on what Nate was talking about, just in Mayport alone, I got somewhere between 3 and 6 ships underway. I got to go stop maintenance on all those availabilities that are going on and try to button those up. Put heavy weather moors. Go make those ships secure. We sandbag everything out. We got to get helicopters, alerts, sorties. So that's training that we're not doing because we're actually doing real world search and rescue. So all this, this tension that goes on with this is, it does already, I think, slow down an already challenging problem. And to the point about kind of the future, I like to kind of engineer things out of the problem. And so that's why renewable energies and sustainable energies and nuclear power and putting things, building them correctly the first time. But that's not our nature. We live in these very short-term cycles. Nate talked a little bit about the Arctic, and I could go on and on there. I've been really on a campaign the last 2 years about what's happening up there with Russia and China. But from a structural thing, and I didn't really have a sense of this, of how much was dependent on the thermofrost up there as foundational rock, that we thought was, a way I could put a pylon into. And now that's actually been, it's in jeopardy in places like northern parts of Alaska and, of course, the northern coastline of Canada. So all these things are challenged to the person who asked that question.
Yeah. All right. I see we have a line here. Ma'am?
Good afternoon. Lieutenant Junior Grade Amy Chittum, instructor at the United States Coast Guard Academy, Department of Culture and Languages. My question for you, Admiral, is you're talking about building resilient structures for Coast Guard equipment to reduce time to get back into operational status. For the last 2 years, my students and I have been working on a structural building that could be used to house coastie families in these emergencies to keep them from having to be evacuated during hurricanes, to reduce the time and cost associated with evacuations. My question to you is, has this crossed the minds yet of the uppers of how to keep the Coast Guard from actually having to leave in the first place, especially their families, so they can focus on the job that needs to be done?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I have not heard of that, but I am actually very interested. That's so part of that question is really important to understand for us in the Coast Guard. We don't have big bases. You know, we don't have big bases. We don't have any way to really do that. So all of our facilities are scattered along the coastline. You know, I mean that's historic in some sense from boat station response, but we live and work. Our families live and work in the communities. You know, where they are. So we don't have like a hubbed base where the logistics can be brought in and people can be hunkered down in housing or whatever. So when these storms come, our families all the ships and aircraft leave with the active duty member and the families all evacuate, and we have to bring them back. And it's a tremendous logistics effort, and it's really difficult, obviously, on the families. So the fact that someone's actually working on the idea of maybe some way for us to do that a little bit differently and be able to support our families better, that's fantastic. I've not heard of it. I'm certainly really interested in what you all produce. I think it would be something we would be very interested in using. Because we can't change our model, right? There's no way we can say, well, there's just certain parts of the coast, certain ports where the Coast Guard's just not going to be anymore. That's not the answer. We're going to have to continue to be everywhere. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Admiral.
Ma'am, go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks to the panel for your amazing perspectives. My question is about workforce development. Thinking about things like the uncertain future that our scientists, engineers, and decision makers are going into, do you feel that our emerging workforce is being equipped with the skills they need to make these decisions? And do you see any necessary skills that we should be implementing at either K through 12, undergraduate, or graduate levels?
Is that for me?
That's not a question for the professor. Yeah.
For all of you. It's for all of you.
Come on.
So just as I did this afternoon, I gave you a few facts that made sense, right? And they were visual. Normally scientists try and drill down to the third decimal place, you know, and give you the curves and so on. The big picture is really valuable here. And I think we can do a better job of that even at young grades. Because again, this builds upon natural Earth history, the Ice Age cycles. Most people just never thought to connect the Ice Age cycles with what's happening now. And when you put it in perspective, it really does help. So I've taught this to you know, very young children, and they can understand it perfectly well. In fact, the kids, my daughter is 23, that generation, you know, they know the planet's warming. They know the patterns are changing of weather. The rain's unpredictable, the storms are unpredictable, the storm surge, and they know the ice is melting and the sea level's rising, even if they don't want to become a scientist. We can speak to that. We can speak honestly, and again, I had to say, but depoliticize it. It just drives me crazy that people on both sides, just to be clear, there's people who deny that climate change is happening and that we affect it, and there's people who act as if picking up litter on the beach and recycling, which is really important, and I do it, but that's going to stop climate change. Okay, both are nonsense. Okay, we've got to start talking the truth. This is a really big deal. It's not just for our generation, but for the future, and we've got to start articulating it well.
Ma'am? Oh, let's go to this side now.
Vice Admiral, you mentioned earlier that there's no support or response assets in the Arctic as far as if our ships are up there, but there's no bases or ports essentially to go back to. So what types of infrastructure has the Navy and Coast Guard considered to support those ships once it melts even more, and especially with the melting thermofrost where the infrastructure that's already there is unstable? What are we building and predicting for that in the future?
Sure, thanks. So it's a good question. I mean, I can speak obviously to the Coast Guard side, and maybe Admiral Caldwell obviously can speak to the Navy side. But I mean, you know, the United States does not have a deep water port in the Arctic, right, above the Arctic Circle, right, by definition. The Russians certainly do. Numerous response bases, airfields. There's work going on in Nome right now. For a deep water port expansion, it's not, it isn't done yet, but that work is ongoing. That's not the Arctic. It's close. It's not quite the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle. So I think from our standpoint, I guess maybe to answer your question, I don't know if that's necessarily the answer. I don't think you're going to see the United States making a concerted effort to build a lot of deep water ports. I don't know if that's what we would need. I think what we need is the capability. The way I would describe it is we need the capability with the icebreakers, the ships, the aircraft, and then we can home port them in Seattle. We can home port them in lots of places and provide that presence, on a permanent basis, right? A very persistent presence in the Arctic. Doesn't really matter where they're home ported. I don't know
if I can add to that.
Sure.
The U.S., as you mentioned, is part of the 8-nation Arctic Council. That's Canada, Russia, the U.S., and the 5 Scandinavian countries, including Iceland. And they've mapped out the Arctic thoroughly in terms of search and rescue, if there was another disaster up there. And there's a base at the south end of Greenland, of Iceland, at Narsok, that there really is good cooperation. In fact, the commandant a few years ago had me, take them around Greenland and Iceland and stuff, and I learned a lot in that process too, because I learned a lot more about the Coast Guard's assets, but not only for the U.S. Coast Guard, for the other 7 nations. So there really is a pretty sophisticated
I think that's
program.
a really good point. One thing, maybe I should have said this better in my comments earlier, but the United States doesn't have presence there, but the Canadians have a lot of exceptional asset capability for working in the Arctic, right? I mean, the Canadian coastline spans the Arctic, both on the Atlantic and the Pacific side. The rest of the Arctic Council nations, the European Arctic nations, they obviously have, the Finns have more icebreakers than any other country in the world, Finland, right? And a very small country. So I guess what I was saying is, I think in the U.S. Arctic, right, for our exclusive economic zone, for our coastal waters, the Coast Guard is the presence that you have up there. Internationally, there is certainly a coalition of like-minded partner nations that provide capability in the Arctic.
Can I pile onto it too a little bit on, we don't have enough search and rescue up there. It's not good enough. We're not going to conduct military exercises and operations in general above the polar ice cap, aviation in particular, with the search and rescue capability and response times that we have. It's a deficiency. U.S. Northern Command understands this. I certainly do. So it's not good. I mean, the only things that really can operate up there other than the icebreakers are U.S. submarines. So we are there. There's strong presence there. We maintain a proficiency in doing that. Of course, Russian submarines are up there as well. So that's predominantly in icebreakers. They have a massive icebreaking fleet. And so it is challenged up there. And then the other thing I would add is when we say Arctic, we just want to kind of go focus on the polar ice cap. But the Arctic is anything above the Arctic Circle. So our ability to operate above the Arctic Circle is extremely important as well. And so that's from communication systems, navigation, timing, the austere conditions, our systems operating those cold temperatures. And we have to have this kind of an enhanced presence up there, working with our great allies to make sure our capabilities are built to actually not cede that space to Russia, to China, and anyone else, so we can sustain operations in that environment. It is opening up. There will be commercial transit lanes going across the Northern Sea Route for large parts of the year. When that happens, we have to be able to operate in that region. And search and rescue is a normal part of that.
Thanks.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Midshipman First Class Prescott. Whether to deal with natural disasters or imminent conflict, the need for a highly skilled workforce is more apparent than ever. With the loss of skilled civilian labor, such as welders, to private industry due to salary disparity, as well as the ability for high wages paid by private industry as a result of the migration from fixed price contracts to cost plus, are there any plans in action for conserving this vital workforce for more like in-house operations?
I'll take a stab at that. Yes. There is. And everything you just said is fully recognized by Navy leadership. I mean, you just tore a page out of my, speech that I gave probably 2 months ago or something. It's exactly, you quantify the problem very precisely. Let me give you for instance, in Hampton Roads alone. In Hampton Roads, you've got Huntington Ingalls Industry, Newport News Shipbuilding. You've got Norfolk Naval Shipyard. You've got Regional Maintenance Center Norfolk there. You got 2 other private yards with BAE and NASCO there. So it is people are basically just rotating around a bit, trying to land the best salary they can get. So there's a massive competition for labor. And you could go find other places where that's the case as well. Up in New England, at Electric Boat and Quonset Point, they have a similar challenge. One of the problems that we have, if you go look for most industries, when we get college graduates, for instance, and what they consider to be job opportunity, they look at the country as job opportunity. In fact, most of you in here have children or yourself, you're not working where you necessarily went to college. But in these trade type of industries, the circle by which somebody grows up and where they get a job is very coupled. And so expanding that market is something we're working hard on. That's why you see us advertising on NASCAR. That's why you see, submarines.com. That's why you see us building facilities and partnering with community colleges all around to try to entice people to come in. And then we give them a job, we train them to do that job, and we move them to a facility where we want them to carry that out. It is tough to compete with private industry, but we do pretty good. In fact, I think private industry worries more about the stability of their labor force than I think we do. We're all hurting, but the stability is a bit more slanted toward them. And the reason that's the case is they're working for the cloth of their nation. And so that makes a difference. So mission matters. And when we can convey that mission appropriately, people stay in this industry a really long time. There's a lot of legacy in it.
Wonderful. All right, we have time for one last question. We'll go to this gentleman here.
Commander Rastigo, visiting fellow for the Simpson Center. The general consensus I've got is that with the Arctic, doesn't seem to be we don't have a lot of assets there due to the changing environment that's going to be very difficult. So there doesn't seem to be a strong appetite to go forth and build kind of infrastructure to build a stronger presence within the Arctic. Yet I see China, a non-Arctic nation, is developing icebreakers. Russia just kind of celebrated their first Panmax container ship that transited the Northeast Passage. What would kind of be the tipping point that you would see that, okay, now we need to turn to Congress and say, hey, look, we had our priorities, but now we need to actually seriously think about reinvesting into Arctic infrastructure?
Maybe I'll start, Nate, then you pick up. And, a lot of this is dual purposing facilities. So Canada is doing a lot of resource mining, drilling, oil, different minerals, and a lot of that's in the northern coastline of their country. They have to have deep water ports to pull in the ships to actually put those materials on that. There is no reason, and we are trying to do this more effectively, is to partner with Canada to allow those ports to be dual purpose for our ships and Coast Guard. So I think that's probably a big part of it is partnerships. Of course, we do this with Norway already, certainly above the Arctic Circle, where you may have seen in the news we're working with Canada and Finland on what U.S. icebreakers would look like and how to build out a trilateral coalition there to build U.S. icebreakers for Navy. And of course, the Coast Guard is doing their icebreaker as well, and that's important. So to have that presence and to be able to be there when we need to be there is I think, partnerships, as we've mentioned, dual purposing, and making sure that we can utilize their ports, and that's allies and partners, kind of our special sauce as a U.S. Navy and Coast Guard. And then we have to build these capabilities I just brought to be able to get up there and to police that area. Because if you can't see it, you do not have maritime domain awareness. So the Coast Guard has to be there. And I'll turn it over to you.
That's all right. So you kind of mentioned sort of the the level of effort, right, from the country. It's happening like now. We're seeing it now. I mean, the Coast Guard was appropriated in FY25. We were appropriated money to buy a commercially available icebreaker, which we are going to do, right? So we have the icebreakers that we operate now, the couple that we run now, and we're going to buy this ship that's named the IVIC. It's an Edison's West vessel that was usually previously used by the oil industry. In the meantime, we're building these polar security cutters. We've got, first one underway with design finishing up, and then we're hoping, to get at least 3 of those. I mean, these are things, if you had asked us that question 5 or 10 years ago, I think we'd have a hard time answering. like what's sort of the federal level of effort. And what Admiral Caudill says is exactly right. And then I would just tell you that in terms of like Coast Guard shipbuilding, it's the #1 priority in the Coast Guard's acquisition budget, and that is what you're seeing today. Those icebreakers are coming. The United States is building capacity to have persistent presence in the Arctic.
John?
And I should just clarify, I said something wrong before. The Coast Guard is part of the Arctic Council, and there are 8 nations, including Russia, as I said. Our search and rescue coordination with the other 7 nations is still ongoing, even with the Russian conflict at the moment, I understand. That's one thing that prevails, because in the case of, there could be a tragedy up there tomorrow, in effect. There are 2 different bases, and I confuse them. At the south end of Greenland is Narsok, which is a Greenland base, but which means Denmark, because Greenland is part of Denmark, of course, and all the Arctic nations will work on that. But the U.S. particularly has a good relationship with the Danes and the Greenlandics. And then on Iceland, there's Keflavik, which is the name of the airport you fly into in Iceland, if you've ever been there. And I just read an article in the public press a few weeks ago that the U.S. is bolstering its presence in Keflavik, too. So both Greenland and Iceland are getting attention in terms of being better support for what's happening as the Arctic melts and sea routes open up.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Please join me in thanking these.
Ms. Sikorsky, thank you for moderating this panel. Thank you to our panelists. Just another eye-opening, very interesting panel to round out the day. I think it's been an amazing day. I thank all our participants who joined us in person and virtually. This kind of concludes the day, but I want to thank a few folks before we wrap. The Naval Academy, specifically, as a great partner for putting on this conference. Samara Fireball, Dr. Bob Fishman. I think the soup is in here somewhere. Is she hiding somewhere? Is she in here? Oh, there she is. Hi. Thank you for your partnership. I think it's been a great day for all of us. And of course, we have to thank the William M. Wood Foundation for sponsoring this history conference every year. This is the 14th one. I think you're going to see many more following this one. And then I want to let you know at conclusion here, we're going to have some more fun. Everybody's invited up to the 3rd floor terrace, the topside terrace, for a brief reception. We're going to recognize some more winners of essay contests. So these are the Diversity and Inclusion and Future of Naval Warfare essay contests. So I hope to see you up there. And an administrative note, we're going to keep the shuttle buses running continuously until 5 p.m., so make sure you leave by 5 p.m. Or you're going to miss the bus. And thank you again for supporting this event, and safe travels if you're traveling. Thank you.